The gallery was bright, stark white walls contrasting against the vibrant pieces of art scattered throughout the space. It was a well-known venue in the city's cultural district, a place where collectors and critics gathered, searching for the next big thing in the art world. Despite the polished air of sophistication, there was an undercurrent of tension. The kind of tension one could feel when someone didn't belong. Lance Robinson stood quietly in the corner of the gallery, nervously clutching a rolled-up canvas in his hands. His heart thudded in his chest as he surveyed the room. Art enthusiasts walked past, discussing the pieces, their voices full of admiration and highbrow critique. But no one looked at him. No one saw him. It had been a long, tiring journey for Lance to get to this point. He had worked tirelessly, painting for years, honing his craft in solitude, his talent often ignored because of the color of his skin. As an African-American artist trying to break into the prestigious art scene, Lance had faced more rejection than acceptance. Still, his passion never wavered. He believed in his art, even when the world didn't. Today, he was finally getting a chance to present his work at one of the city's most respected galleries. He had submitted his pieces with the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would finally recognize the depth of his vision. But as he watched the elegant crowd drift by, he began to feel the familiar sting of doubt. "Excuse me," a voice broke through his reverie. Lance turned, and there, standing before him, was the gallery owner himself, Vincent Blanchard. Blanchard was a tall, imposing figure, well-dressed in a sharp black suit, a twinkle of condescension in his eyes as he looked Lance up and down. The owner's sharp features and perfectly groomed appearance spoke of someone who had an air of superiority, someone who had spent years curating an elite circle of patrons. Blanchard's eyes flickered toward the rolled-up canvas under Lance's arm. His lips curled into a thin smile. "And what do we have here?" Blanchard asked, his voice laced with mockery. "Another undiscovered genius eager to make his mark?" Lance stiffened, his grip tightening on the canvas. He had been warned about Blanchard's arrogance, but it still stung to feel the dismissal in his tone. I'm Lance Robinson," he stammered, struggling to keep his composure. "I'm here to present my work for your consideration." Blanchard raised an eyebrow, glancing around the gallery. Well, it's a bit crowded today. I've already made my selections, but I'm always willing to take a quick glance at something new. Let's see what you've got." Lance hesitated for a moment. He had come this far, hadn't he? He couldn't back down now. He unfurled the canvas carefully, revealing his work. It was a stunning piece, bold strokes of color swirling together in a fierce and captivating display. There was a sense of movement in the piece, a dynamic energy that seemed to leap off the canvas. Blanchard's eyes skimmed over the artwork quickly, a brief flicker of disinterest crossing his face. He didn't even stop to study the intricacies of the piece, to really engage with the raw emotion Lance had poured into it. Instead, he made a small, dismissive noise. "Well," Blanchard said, tapping his chin lightly, "it's certainly something. But honestly, I don't think it fits the current trend, you know? People are really into minimalist, high-end concepts these days. Bold colors and abstract shapes? It's a bit, well, old-fashioned, don't you think?" Lance's stomach sank. He had heard this type of critique before, art that was too bold, too different, too unpolished for the likes of those who held the power to shape the art world. It was always the same, he was an outsider in their eyes. But this time, this moment, was supposed to be different. This time, he was finally putting his work out there. Blanchard continued, undeterred. "You see, there's a certain sophistication required to be taken seriously in this space. I don't think you're quite ready for this type of platform yet." The words stung, cutting through Lance like shards of glass. Blanchard hadn't even taken the time to really understand the message behind the work, to feel the emotions woven into each stroke of paint. It wasn't about fitting into a mold. It was about expression, about telling stories that mattered. But Blanchard didn't care about any of that. All he saw was a black artist, standing in front of a canvas, and that, apparently, was not worth his time. "You're probably better off showing your work at one of those smaller, less prestigious venues, Blanchard continued, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. I mean, I'm sure someone will appreciate it, but it's just not what we're looking for here. Lance's mind raced. He felt humiliated, invisible. He had poured his heart and soul into this piece, believing that it could transcend barriers and reach a wide audience. But Blanchard, with his condescending tone and dismissive attitude, had reduced it to nothing more than a passing curiosity. With a forced smile, Blanchard turned on his heel, already moving on to the next patron. Lance stood there, stunned, clutching the canvas to his chest as the laughter and chatter of the gallery continued around him, oblivious to his presence. He couldn't help but feel like the world was turning its back on him once again. The humiliation washed over him like a wave, and for a brief moment, he wanted to walk out of the gallery and never look back. But something inside him pushed back against that urge. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Lance had spent years perfecting his craft. He wasn't about to let one arrogant gallery owner define his future. I'll show them, he muttered to himself under his breath. As he packed up his canvas and left the gallery, his heart was heavy with disappointment. But there was a spark of something else, too, something that burned just a little brighter. Determination. He would prove Blanchard wrong. One day, the art world would see his worth. And when that day came, the gallery owner wouldn't be able to ignore him. He just had to keep going. And he would. No matter what. Lance walked down the city's quiet streets, the canvas still rolled up under his arm. His footsteps echoed in the cool evening air as the glow of streetlights cast long shadows over the sidewalks. He had never felt more alone, but in that solitude, he also felt something else, a quiet fire stirring within him. He wasn't done yet. No, this was just the beginning of something bigger. The mocking words of Vincent Blanchard echoed in his mind, but they weren't enough to crush his resolve. The rejection was painful, yes, but it had sparked something deeper, something that had been building for years. Lance was more than capable of creating work that would be remembered. If Blanchard couldn't see it, then he would find someone who could. And when that happened, he would make sure it was impossible to ignore him. As the days passed, Lance threw himself into his studio even more fiercely. He spent hours in the dimly lit room, surrounded by canvases and half-finished pieces, working tirelessly to perfect his craft. His paintings were vivid, expressive, raw with emotion. They told stories of struggle, of beauty, of triumph, each one a piece of himself laid bare for the world to see. But it wasn't just about the technique or the story anymore. Lance had something new, something he had been working on in secret. A piece unlike anything he had ever painted before. It was a masterpiece, the culmination of years of practice, learning, and passion. The painting was bold, full of contrast, yet harmonized in a way that only Lance could achieve. A towering figure, half human, half abstract, stood in the center, surrounded by bursts of color that swirled and meshed together like fire and water colliding. It was a piece that demanded attention. It was something no one had seen before, yet it felt familiar, because it was an undeniable reflection of the artist himself. Every brushstroke was intentional, every hue carefully chosen to convey a message of resilience and power. It was also worth millions. Lance had known for a long time that this piece would be special. But the full weight of its potential only struck him after hours of intense introspection and a deeper understanding of the art market. Art wasn't just about technique, it was about rarity, about the stories that could be told with a single image. A painting like this, a work that bridged the gap between abstract and realism in such a profound way, would surely be sought after by the right people. It had a level of depth and emotional complexity that could only be found in the works of the most celebrated artists. Despite the rejection from Blanchard's gallery, Lance felt no doubt in his heart about the masterpiece. He knew it would make its way into the right hands, where it would be appreciated, valued, and ultimately become an iconic piece of art. What he didn't expect, however, was the speed at which it would all unfold. One evening, Lance decided to take the painting to a small but well-respected private viewing at a gallery downtown. It wasn't a place as prominent as Blanchard's venue, but it had a loyal, knowledgeable clientele, serious collectors who understood the significance of art beyond trends and social status. Lance's reputation had started to spread, and there were whispers of an artist whose work had a unique intensity, someone who was on the verge of greatness. The gallery was intimate, filled with white walls and warm lighting. A small crowd of collectors stood around, discussing the various pieces. Lance was a little nervous, but knew this was his chance to present the piece to a more discerning audience. When the curator, a middle-aged woman named Elise, approached him, she looked at the canvas with a certain level of professionalism that made Lance feel instantly respected. Elise wasn't the type to shower praise without understanding the work, and her keen eye was exactly what he needed. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the canvas. Lance nodded, stepping back so she could take a closer look. Elise took her time, walking around the piece, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the frame. The silence stretched between them, but Lance didn't mind. It wasn't the awkward quiet of Blanchard's mockery. This was the silence of someone who was truly considering the art before them. Finally, Elise turned to him, her eyes wide with appreciation. "This," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "this is extraordinary." Lance felt his heart leap in his chest. He had heard praise before, but there was something about Elise's tone that made him believe she truly saw the work for what it was. "I've seen many pieces in my time," she continued, "but this is something different. It's raw, it's unapologetic. It's bold, yet it carries so much depth. I can already see it becoming a centerpiece in a major collection." Lance's pulse quickened. You really think so?" "I don't just think so," Elise said with a smile. "I know so." After a few more moments of contemplation, Elise nodded, her eyes flickering with interest. "I'll be honest with you, Lance. I don't know what market you're working with right now, but I'll tell you this. If this piece were to go to auction, it could easily sell for a few million. At least." Lance's jaw dropped. The weight of her words hit him like a tidal wave. A few million? Could it really be that valuable? Elise seemed to notice his surprise and softened her tone. "It's not just about the technique, although that's certainly impressive. It's about what the piece represents. It's fresh, unique. It could be one of those works that defines an era." Lance felt a surge of emotion. The validation he had been craving for years finally arrived in the form of a simple statement from someone who truly understood. He had worked for this moment, sacrificed countless hours, and now, finally, his masterpiece was being recognized. Over the next few days, Elise worked quickly, reaching out to several high-profile collectors who had an eye for emerging talent. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, Lance's piece was being auctioned off at a prestigious event, and bids soared beyond anyone's expectations. As the final bid came in, the auctioneer's voice echoed through the room, "Sold for $5 million. Lance stood frozen, his hands trembling as the realization washed over him. He had done it. He had created a piece of art that wasn't just a product of his struggle and vision, it was something that had the power to transform his future. And while this success felt incredibly sweet, it also made him realize that his journey was far from over. The rejection he had faced before, the mockery from Blanchard, it didn't matter anymore. He wasn't the struggling artist in the corner of the gallery anymore. He was now a force to be reckoned with in the art world. Lance knew one thing for sure, he had only just begun. It had only been a few weeks since Lance's $1 million sale, but the shift in his life was already unmistakable. His name was becoming more and more recognized in the art world. News of his masterpiece auctioning for millions spread like wildfire, and it wasn't long before he received offers from prestigious galleries and collectors eager to showcase his work. He was no longer an unknown artist, he was a star on the rise. Yet, despite the growing acclaim and newfound wealth, Lance couldn't shake the feeling of bitterness that lingered whenever he thought of Vincent Blanchard and his gallery. Blanchard had mocked him, dismissed him, and told him his art wasn't worth anything more than a small, unimportant space on a wall. It was hard to forget those words. They had left a mark, one that had fueled Lance's fire, but still stung whenever he recalled that moment in the gallery. But Lance wasn't one to dwell on the past. His success was now undeniable. He had his own gallery showings, private commissions, and invitations to exclusive events. The art world had shifted to see him as one of its brightest stars. Despite the whirlwind of offers and opportunities, there was still one thing Lance hadn't done yet. He hadn't fully confronted the man who had once belittled him. It wasn't that Lance craved revenge, no, it was more about asserting his own worth. He needed Blanchard to see him for what he truly was, someone with immense value, not just as an artist, but as a force to be reckoned with. There was satisfaction in that, but more than that, there was a sense of closure. Blanchard had tried to define Lance's future in that moment of mockery, but now it was time for Lance to define his own. He couldn't stay in the world of low expectations forever. That's when the decision came to him. He would leave the spotlight of the city's major art circles for a time and visit Blanchard's gallery, not as the struggling artist, but as a wealthy and successful art buyer. Lance would walk into that space, not with the goal of showcasing his work or begging for recognition, but to make a statement. He would prove that his success was not a fluke. He had found his place, and now it was time for Blanchard to witness it. Lance arrived at Blanchard's gallery on a brisk Tuesday afternoon. The area was quiet, the streets still damp from the morning rain. The gallery stood on a prominent corner of the art district, its sleek glass windows displaying works that often catered to the elite, well-heeled patrons who were more concerned with status than true appreciation for the art itself. Lance paused outside, staring at the modern lines of the building. For a brief moment, he reconsidered the plan. What was he really hoping to accomplish by walking through those doors? Was this about pride? Or was it about proving to himself that he had the power to leave his own mark on this world? He straightened his jacket, adjusted his tie, and took a deep breath. He had earned this. Every single step of the way. As he entered the gallery, the cold air inside hit him, and he felt the tension of the moment settle into his chest. The gallery was immaculate, pristine in its white walls and polished floors. But it felt different now, empty, almost sterile. Lance had never realized how much the place lacked in soul, how cold and impersonal it felt. It wasn't about the art anymore, it was about the transactional nature of the space, about the profit-driven motives that drove its operation. He walked confidently through the gallery, glancing at the pieces on the walls. They were technically stunning, yes, but something was missing. They felt like products, not pieces of living, breathing art. As he wandered deeper into the space, a sense of disconnect washed over him. "Good afternoon," came a voice, pulling Lance out of his thoughts. It was Vincent Blanchard, who approached him with that same well-practiced smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Lance recognized the look immediately, the calculated politeness, the feigned interest. It was the same way Blanchard had greeted every artist who came to him with hope and ambition. But now, the tables had turned. Blanchard didn't recognize Lance at first. His eyes flicked over him briefly, before moving on to the next person in the room. Lance smiled inwardly. This was the perfect moment to make his entrance. "Mr. Blanchard," Lance said, his voice clear and calm. Blanchard stopped mid-step, turning slowly. His gaze swept over Lance once more, as if trying to place him. There was something about the way Lance stood there, confident, assured, that gave him pause. And then, it clicked. "Wait a minute," Blanchard said, his tone shifting from polite to skeptical. "Are you Lance Robinson?" Lance nodded, feeling the weight of his name settle in the room. He watched as Blanchard's face slowly drained of color, the recognition dawning in the gallery owner's eyes. Blanchard cleared his throat awkwardly, his smile faltering. I wasn't expecting you here," he stammered. "I thought you were busy with all the success you've had lately." His voice was tinged with forced politeness, though his discomfort was evident. Lance didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked around the gallery once more, his gaze deliberately lingering on a few pieces, a series of paintings that, in his eyes, held little substance, much like the cold, corporate atmosphere that permeated the space. He could almost hear Blanchard's thoughts running through his head. "This is him, the artist who had the nerve to defy me. The one whose work I dismissed. The one who made me look like a fool. It's an interesting space, Lance said quietly, his voice measured, almost disinterested. A lot of commercial art. Blanchard bristled, but he tried to recover. We have some excellent pieces here, pieces that appeal to a very discerning clientele. You know, art is about taste, Lance. It's not always about raw emotion or radical expression. It's about what people are willing to pay for. Lance raised an eyebrow. And I suppose that's what you're offering, Mr. Blanchard. The art that people are willing to pay for. Nothing more. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence between them. Lance could see the embarrassment creeping up Blanchard's face. The same man who had mocked him just weeks ago was now standing before him, clearly rattled by the quiet power that Lance exuded. I think, Lance continued, his voice growing firmer, that I can offer something different than what you have here. Blanchard blinked, confusion clouding his features. What do you mean? Lance stepped closer, his voice low but confident. I mean that I'm in the position to make this gallery, and many others, very successful. Because I know what true art is. I know what it takes to make it valuable. After the encounter at Blanchard's gallery, Lance felt lighter. The satisfaction of standing his ground and walking out, leaving Blanchard behind, filled him with a newfound confidence. He had always known that his art had value, but now, the world was beginning to see it too. His success wasn't just about the money or the recognition, it was about control. Lance had taken control of his own destiny, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away. The art world, it seemed, was full of gatekeepers, people who thought they held the power to dictate who deserved to be seen and who didn't. Blanchard had been one of them. But Lance now realized that the true power lay not in being approved by these gatekeepers, but in owning the narrative, in creating a space where he dictated the terms. Lance had been approached by several buyers and galleries in the weeks following the auction, each wanting to display his work or acquire a piece. But Lance knew he needed more than just a place to sell his art. He needed a platform where his voice could resonate, where his vision could be shared with a broader audience. What he needed was control over how his art was presented, and who could have access to it. That's when the idea came to him. Lance had always been an independent soul, someone who rejected the idea of selling out or compromising his vision. He didn't want to be just another artist whose work was bought and sold for profit. He wanted to create something that transcended that. He wanted to create a brand, a legacy that could change the art world forever. Over the next few months, Lance worked tirelessly to build his own space. He didn't want to rely on anyone else to define his success. So, he opened his own gallery, a bold move that defied the conventional paths most artists took. But for Lance, it felt right. He designed the gallery not just as a place to sell his own art, but as a sanctuary for other artists like him, those who had been overlooked, misunderstood, or rejected by the mainstream. The gallery was everything Lance had dreamed of. It was modern, sleek, and raw, with an atmosphere that encouraged creativity and self-expression. But more than that, it was a statement. This space wasn't just for art collectors, it was for the artists. The people who truly created the culture. The ones who didn't conform to the rules. The grand opening of the gallery was a spectacle. The press covered it, influencers flooded the venue, and collectors rushed to secure pieces from the newly minted art star. Lance's work was the centerpiece, of course, but it was more than that. It was a movement. People came to the gallery not just to admire art, but to be part of something bigger, something that would disrupt the very foundations of the art world. As the days passed, Lance's influence grew. He quickly became known not just as an artist, but as a curator, a visionary, someone who could reshape the landscape of modern art. His gallery became a hub of creativity and innovation, attracting young, emerging artists whose work didn't fit neatly into the boxes of traditional galleries. This was a space for the underdogs, the ones whose art was raw and unfiltered, the ones who didn't care about playing it safe. One of Lance's first acts as the owner of his own gallery was to invite several artists who had been ignored or dismissed by the traditional art world. One of them was Marie Fontaine, a painter whose abstract works had been written off by every major gallery in the city. She had been told countless times that her art was too chaotic or too dark. But Lance saw something in her work that others didn't, a sense of rebellion, a refusal to conform. Her art was a reflection of the world's complexities, and Lance knew that it had a place in his gallery. When Marie's first show opened, it was a huge success. The critics who had previously dismissed her now called her one of the most exciting new talents of the year. It wasn't just the art that made her show so special, it was the way Lance had championed her, the way he had given her the platform to be herself, unapologetically. But even as Lance celebrated his own success, he couldn't forget the reality of the art world. Success in this industry was fleeting. Trends changed. Collectors moved on to the next big thing. Lance had seen it happen to so many artists before him, those who had risen to fame only to fall into obscurity as quickly as they had come. That's why Lance had built his gallery the way he had, so that it wasn't just about one artist or one style. It was about creating a lasting community. A place where art could live and evolve, where the work of every artist mattered, not just for its price tag but for its authenticity. But Lance's rise hadn't gone unnoticed by the old guard of the art world. Blanchard, for one, had not forgotten their last encounter. His gallery was losing patrons to Lance's new space, and he didn't like it. He had always believed that the success of an artist was determined by the galleries that supported them, and now, here was Lance Robinson, a once dismissed artist, creating a rival space that not only overshadowed his but threatened to change the very fabric of the industry. Blanchard wasn't one to go down without a fight. As Lance's influence grew, so did the animosity between the two men. Blanchard had always operated under the belief that the elite, the established galleries, controlled the market. He thought that his snub of Lance had been justified. After all, who could have predicted that a struggling artist like Lance would disrupt the entire art scene? But Lance wasn't a part of the system. He was redefining it. And that was the greatest threat of all. The tension between the two men came to a head one evening at a gala event. It was the kind of event Blanchard loved, a cocktail party for the high-powered patrons of the art world. It was a night where the elite gathered, not to appreciate art, but to make deals. The air was thick with pretense, and the glassy-eyed collectors spent their time talking numbers rather than aesthetics. Lance was invited to the event, but he had no interest in mingling with the industry's power players. He didn't need their approval anymore. Instead, he found himself scanning the room for one person, Blanchard. He wanted to see just how far Blanchard was willing to go to keep his grip on the art world. When their eyes met, the tension was palpable. Blanchard's face, stiff and calculating, met Lance's calm, unbothered gaze. There was no confrontation, no grand showdown. But in that moment, both men understood that the battle for control of the art world was far from over. Lance knew one thing for sure, the game was changing. And he was in control now. The night after the gala event, Lance couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The tension between him and Blanchard had escalated into a silent battle for control of the art world. Lance had won the early skirmishes, his gallery was a success, and more young artists were flocking to him, but he knew that Blanchard wouldn't let go without a fight. Blanchard was a man of influence, of wealth, and of power. He didn't like being outshined, especially not by someone who had once been beneath him. Lance sat in his office, looking out over the bustling city from his sleek, minimalist space. His gallery had become a symbol of disruption, but the real battle was just beginning. He wasn't concerned about his own success anymore. It was about something bigger. He had created a platform where artists could thrive without having to sell their souls to the highest bidder. But there were forces at work that wanted to undermine that vision. Lance's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was an email from his assistant. He opened it and read the message with growing unease. There had been whispers. Collectors, high-profile individuals in the art world, were starting to talk about Lance Robinson's gallery in less than flattering terms. There were murmurs of unrefined art, disruptive displays, and the classic accusation of being too raw. The elite galleries, particularly Blanchard's, were starting to band together, hoping to undermine Lance's credibility by discrediting his work and his gallery. The email detailed that one of Blanchard's biggest clients, a prominent billionaire known for his impeccable taste, had pulled his investments from Lance's gallery, citing concerns over the direction Lance was taking with his curated shows. The billionaire was now planning to invest in a new gallery that was promising a return to tradition, a thinly veiled jab at Lance's unorthodox approach. Lance wasn't surprised. It was exactly what he'd expected. Blanchard had always operated within the rules of the old guard, where status, tradition, and profit were paramount. Lance's radical departure from this was a direct threat to everything Blanchard, and others like him, stood for. But Lance wasn't one to back down. If anything, the challenge only made him more determined. He knew that the true strength of his gallery lay not in the wealth it attracted but in its ideology. It was a place for artists who refused to be confined by old standards, a place that prioritized creativity over commerce. It was a new era, and Lance wasn't going to let a few rumors shake his resolve. In the coming days, Lance put together a plan. He would host a new exhibition, one that would not only showcase the best of what his gallery had to offer, but also publicly confront the criticisms being leveled against him. He would invite the biggest critics, the wealthy patrons, and the art world's elite to see the true value of the art he was championing. This exhibition would be a statement, not just about his own work, but about the future of art itself. The theme of the exhibition would be revolution, art in the new age. Lance wanted to break the mold entirely. He invited artists who weren't just pushing boundaries in their style, but who were also challenging the very concept of what art could be. There would be installations that involved technology, interactive displays, and performances that blurred the lines between visual art and other forms of expression. This wasn't just about paintings on a wall, it was about creating an experience. The opening night of the exhibition arrived, and Lance could feel the energy in the air. The gallery was packed with patrons and critics alike, all eager to see what the fuss was about. Lance watched as people mingled, their conversations filled with whispered questions and uncertain excitement. This was the moment. He could feel the weight of it on his shoulders, but he was ready. As the doors opened to reveal the first installation, a hush fell over the crowd. The exhibit was a multimedia piece that combined visual art, sound, and interactive technology. A series of giant, abstract sculptures towered over the guests, their surfaces shifting and changing colors as the viewers moved around them. People stood in awe, mesmerized by the way the art seemed to come to life, responding to their presence in real time. It wasn't traditional art. It wasn't something you could buy and hang on a wall. But that was exactly the point. Lance wasn't trying to cater to people's expectations. He was pushing them to rethink what art could be. The crowd moved from piece to piece, each more daring than the last. One installation used artificial intelligence to generate paintings based on the emotions of the viewers, creating a constantly shifting landscape of colors and shapes. Another featured a performance art piece in which dancers interacted with the audience, breaking down the barrier between creator and observer. And then, just as the crowd began to settle into the rhythm of the exhibition, Lance introduced the final piece, his own work. It was a massive, stunning sculpture that defied all conventions. It was both beautiful and unsettling, filled with raw emotion and visceral expression. It wasn't meant to be easy to understand, it was meant to challenge, to provoke, to stir something deep within the viewer. Lance wanted to show that art didn't have to be nice to be valuable. It didn't have to fit into neat little categories. Art was about expression, about pushing boundaries, about making people feel. As the final piece was revealed, a murmur of excitement rippled through the room. The critics who had dismissed Lance's gallery now stood in stunned silence, captivated by the power of what they were seeing. Even Blanchard's most loyal patrons couldn't deny the impact of the exhibition. The old guard had underestimated Lance, but now, they were being forced to reckon with him. The event lasted late into the night, and as it came to a close, Lance found himself standing at the center of the gallery, surveying the scene. People were talking, sharing their thoughts, and taking photos of the installations. The buzz in the room was palpable. The critics who had once dismissed him were now praising his vision and his ability to push art into new, exciting territories. But there was still work to be done. Lance knew that this exhibition was just the beginning. The battle for the future of art was far from over. There would be more challenges, more resistance from the establishment. But Lance was ready for it. He had built his gallery not just for himself, but for the future, a future where artists no longer had to conform to the old ways, where they could create freely, without fear of judgment. And if Blanchard or anyone else didn't like it, that was their problem. Lance wasn't going anywhere. Lance stood at the front of the gallery, watching the ebb and flow of the crowd. The opening of revolution, art in the new age, had been everything he hoped for and more. The critics who once scorned his methods now marveled at his daring approach, and even the most influential patrons seemed to take notice. It was a triumph of his vision, one that redefined not only the art he created but the art world itself. But as the evening wore on, Lance couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope. The gallery was buzzing with excitement, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty, a sense that the status quo was about to be shaken, and not everyone was ready for it. Lance knew that he had touched a nerve. The old guard, represented by people like Blanchard, wasn't going to let him get away with this without a fight. They would retaliate, and when they did, they would come after him with everything they had. In the days following the exhibition, the media began to buzz with mixed reviews. Some hailed the show as a groundbreaking moment in the art world, a bold step toward a new era of expression. Others, however, were less enthused. Critics from established publications, including those who had once championed the traditional art world, took aim at the exhibit, labeling it chaotic and disjointed. The backlash, though predictable, was harsher than Lance had anticipated. It wasn't just about the art anymore, it was about the challenge to the established norms that he represented. One evening, Lance received a phone call that would further cement his belief that the battle was only beginning. It was Marie Fontaine, the artist he had championed early in his career and who had become a prominent fixture in his gallery. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her words laced with a mix of confusion and frustration. "Lance, I've been hearing rumors," she said, her voice shaky. "Some of the top collectors are pulling out. I just had a meeting with one of them, and they said they're worried about your unconventional direction. They said we need to return to basics. I don't know what to think anymore." Lance's stomach tightened. He had been expecting the pushback, but hearing it from Marie, someone who had been integral to the success of his gallery, stung. She was right to be worried. There were whispers everywhere. It was clear that the old guard wasn't going to let go of its grip on the art world without a fight. They had the money, the influence, and the connections to make life difficult for Lance, Marie, and every artist he had taken under his wing. But Lance wasn't about to let them dictate the terms. "Marie, listen to me," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "What we're doing here is bigger than just one show, or even one gallery. This is a revolution. And revolutions aren't easy. We're disrupting the system, and it's going to push back. But that's how we know we're doing something important." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Lance could hear Marie breathing slowly, processing his words. Finally, she spoke. "I know you're right," she said. "But it's hard. This isn't what we thought it would be. I thought we were making something beautiful, and now it feels like we're tearing everything apart." Lance sighed, his mind racing. He understood her fear. He understood her doubt. But he also knew that they couldn't stop now. If they did, they would be just like every other artist who had ever been co-opted by the system. They would be forgotten. "We're not tearing anything apart," Lance said, his voice gentle but resolute. "We're rebuilding. What we're doing here is changing the very foundation of the art world. But it's going to take time. Trust me, we're on the right path." Marie didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, finally, she spoke again, her voice steadier now. "Okay. I'll keep going. I believe in this. I believe in what we're doing. Lance smiled, feeling the weight of the conversation lift slightly. That's all I need to hear. In the weeks that followed, Lance's resolve was tested like never before. The resistance to his vision grew louder. Blanchard and his allies in the art world began to tighten their grip on the market. The rumors of unconventional art being too disruptive gained traction, and soon, some of the wealthiest patrons of the arts began to distance themselves from Lance's gallery, worried about the impact of supporting someone so outside the mainstream. But Lance wasn't about to back down. The attacks weren't just personal, they were ideological. The traditional art world had long been built on a foundation of exclusivity and elitism. People like Blanchard had cultivated an image of art as something only for the wealthy, only for those who could afford the price tag. But Lance had shattered that notion. He had made art accessible, made it raw and real, and in doing so, he had made it dangerous to those who had built their empires on the idea that art was something that could be controlled. Lance's next move was strategic. He knew that in order to secure his future, and the future of his gallery, he needed to find a way to take the fight to the next level. He couldn't just sit back and wait for the old guard to tear him down. He had to outsmart them, outmaneuver them, and continue pushing the boundaries of what was possible. That's when he came up with an idea: collaboration. If the old guard wanted to isolate him, he would show them the power of unity. He would bring together a collective of like-minded artists, each from different disciplines: painters, sculptors, digital artists, performance artists, and they would create something that no one could ignore. It would be an all-out assault on the traditional art world, a unified front that would show the establishment that the future was not in their hands anymore. Lance spent the next several months carefully curating the group. He reached out to artists whose work he respected and admired, those who had also been sidelined by the old art world. Some of them were hesitant, uncertain of what such a radical collaboration would look like. Others were eager to join the cause, excited by the idea of shaking up the industry. Together, they would create a collective show, a massive, multi-location installation that would span the globe. It would feature works of art that spoke to the struggles of the modern world, the ways in which society had become disconnected from true creativity. The show would be streamed live, broadcast globally, and covered by the media. The world would see, firsthand, the new direction art was taking, and it wouldn't be able to ignore it. As the opening date of the collective exhibition approached, Lance's heart raced with anticipation. He knew that this was the moment that could either make or break his career. If the show succeeded, it would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the future of art lay in the hands of those who dared to challenge the status quo. But if it failed, he would be outcast once more, his gallery, his reputation, and his vision shattered. He stood in his office, staring at the blueprint for the show, a map of all the locations that would host the installations. He was ready. The world was about to see what true revolution in art looked like. And Blanchard? He would have no choice but to watch as everything he had built came crashing down. The day of the collective exhibition arrived, and Lance stood at the center of a whirlwind. The global art event, now known as the Collective Rebirth, was more than just a show, it was a declaration of war against the old establishment. With installations set up in multiple cities across the world, from New York to Tokyo, Paris to Sao Paulo, the exhibition was poised to unite the voices of the most radical, bold, and visionary artists. They weren't just showcasing their art, they were presenting a new worldview, a new way of thinking about the very nature of creativity. Lance had spent months curating and preparing for this moment, and now it had arrived. The artists, each a part of the collective, were already setting up their pieces in the various locations, working tirelessly to ensure everything was ready. There was a palpable energy in the air, a sense of anticipation and purpose that couldn't be ignored. This was more than an exhibition, it was a movement. And Lance was at its helm. He walked through the main gallery in New York City, surveying the space one last time. The walls were adorned with abstract digital paintings that seemed to shift and move before the viewer's eyes. Sculptures made of unexpected materials, reclaimed plastics, metals, and organic elements, created a sense of rebellion, of creation from destruction. Every corner of the gallery was filled with innovation, with artists who had been dismissed by the old guard, now given the chance to shine. Lance stood in front of his own piece, a massive installation that filled the center of the gallery. It was a towering structure made of broken glass, steel, and light, a visual representation of the fractured state of the modern art world. It wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, but it was powerful. It demanded attention. The light within the structure flickered, changing colors as visitors moved closer, symbolizing the shifting tides of the art world itself. The opening event was set to go live in a few hours, and as Lance glanced around the gallery, he saw the familiar faces of some of the art world's biggest critics. They were here, just as he'd anticipated. Some had come with open minds, eager to see what this new generation of artists had to offer. Others were there with their arms crossed, skeptical and ready to dismiss everything they saw. But Lance was ready for them. He had prepared for this moment his entire life. At precisely 7 p.m., the first wave of guests began to trickle in. The atmosphere in the gallery was electric, charged with the knowledge that something big was happening. Artists mingled with patrons, critics, and influencers, all of them excited to be part of something historic. For many, this was their first time seeing the works of these artists in such a monumental way. And for Lance, it was a moment of vindication, a sign that his gamble was paying off. The show was live-streamed, broadcasting to millions of viewers across the globe. As the cameras panned over the installations, the commentary began. Social media exploded with reactions, some praising the boldness of the works, others questioning the meaning and purpose behind them. But what Lance hadn't anticipated was the sheer scale of the public response. The backlash from the old guard had been swift, but the support from a new, younger generation of art lovers and creators was overwhelming. The hashtag revolution in art began trending on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. People shared their experiences of the installations, posted photos and videos, and debated the deeper meanings of the works. It wasn't just an exhibition, it was a cultural moment. Art, once confined to the elite, was now being discussed on a global scale. Everyone had an opinion, and they were all talking about it. As the night unfolded, Lance stood back and watched the reactions unfold in real time. The old guard's criticisms, led by Blanchard and his allies, were growing more vocal. They accused Lance and his collective of trying to destroy the sanctity of art, of making it too accessible, too raw, too chaotic. But these voices were being drowned out by a new chorus, a chorus of young artists, creators, and revolutionaries who were ready to take art back from the gatekeepers and redefine it on their own terms. Lance's phone buzzed as the night wore on. It was a message from Marie. "We did it. The world is watching. There's no turning back now." Lance smiled, feeling the weight of her words sink in. There was no going back. This was it. The revolution was here. But just as he allowed himself a moment to celebrate, he received another message. This one was from an unexpected source, Blanchard himself. "You've done it now, Robinson. You've stirred up something that you can't control. You think you're changing art? No, you're just turning it into a circus. And I'll make sure the world knows it." Lance read the message and, for a brief moment, felt a chill run through him. Blanchard had always been a formidable opponent, a man who wielded power with ease. But Lance knew one thing that Blanchard didn't: the tide had already turned. The old ways were crumbling, and there was no going back. He stood in the center of his gallery, the heart of this revolution, and took in the atmosphere one last time. The battle was far from over, but this moment, the moment when the art world saw the future, was theirs. The collective, the artists, the revolutionaries, they had won the first round. And Lance was going to make sure it wasn't their last. As the cameras continued to roll and the world watched, Lance knew that this was just the beginning. The art world was no longer a place where the elite could control who had access to creativity. It was a place where anyone, regardless of their background or their financial standing, could make their voice heard.